Welcome, everyone. My name is Ji-Yeon Yuh, and I am so pleased to serve as your moderator. Our webinar today is sponsored by the Asian American Studies program and by the Council for Race and Ethnic Studies at Northwestern University with funding from the Mellon Foundation. I am the founding faculty of the Asian American Studies program here at Northwestern, where I teach Asian diaspora and Asian American history, including courses in my specialty, Korean diaspora studies. I'm particularly interested in US militarism and empire, the legacies of the Korean War, and the experiences of Korean women both in Korea and abroad. We have a wonderful conversation for you tonight that will explore some of these topics and more. At the top of our program, we will hear from each of our three speakers. They will then pose questions to each other. After that conversation, we will turn to questions from you, members of the audience, before bidding each other farewell. So please send us your questions in the Q&A box as you think of them. I will be reading them all and curating them for the Q&A session. The human cost of war is varied and long-lasting. Korean Americans know this profound truth, for we have been cut down by war and we have risen again and again from its debilitating violence and lingering effects. But our knowledge has also been obscured and distorted by the neocolonial militarized relationship between Korea and the United States, and by the racialized logic of assimilation and the pursuit of a so-called American dream. Misremembering our own histories has been painful, and it is another cost of war. Today, we have an opportunity to address some of that damage and engage in collective healing through critical analysis and reflection, thanks to the rich, evocative, and heartbreaking memoir, Tastes Like War. It garnered wide media attention and praise, winning the 2022 Asian Pacific American Literature Award for adult nonfiction and selected as a finalist for the 2021 National Book Award for nonfiction. I place this memoir squarely in the field of Korean American and Korean diasporic studies. It lays bare some of the most painful histories, challenges some of the strongest stigmas, and conjures up some of the most beautiful shared memories. Most of all, it is so full of love. Love for mothers and families and communities, for friends, for oneself, for the act of remembering and resisting. So I am immensely honored to introduce our featured guest speaker, the author, Grace M. Cho. Before she published Tastes Like War, she published Haunting the Korean Diaspora, Shame, Secrecy, and the Forgotten War, which received a 2010 book award from the American Sociological Association. Her writings have appeared in journals such as The New Inquiry, Home Memoir Story, Context, Gastronomica, Feminist Studies, WSQ, and Qualitative Inquiry. She is Associate Professor of Sociology and Anthropology at the College of Staten Island, City University of New York. Our second esteemed guest speaker is Mia Charlene White, Assistant Professor of Environmental Studies and Geography at the New School in New York City, where she teaches courses on race and space-making practices in communities of color. She is a parent of two, lives with disability, and identifies as a Black woman of African-American and Korean immigrant descent. She is currently working on her first book manuscript titled Fugitive Planning, a blues epistemology from the undercommons. In keeping with a commitment to public engagement and social justice, Mia has written on, organized, and spoken against anti-Asian violence. She has organized with other passionate New Jersey residents to successfully pass an AAPI curriculum bill in the state of New Jersey and has just been nominated for the Department of Energy Commission for Asian American Heritage. Our third speaker is Yuri Doolan, metaphorically or virtually coming home to Northwestern, although he is physically in Korea on a Fulbright fellowship. Yuri received his PhD in history from Northwestern University in 2019. Advising his graduate work was pure joy for me, and it has been such a pleasure to work with him on this webinar as a colleague. He is currently an assistant professor of history and women's, gender, and sexuality studies, as well as inaugural chair of Asian American and Pacific Islander Studies at Brandeis University. He has a book under contract with Oxford University Press, The First Amerasians, Mixed Race Koreans from Camp Towns to America, that tells the powerful, moving story of how Americans created and used the concept of the Amerasian to remove thousands of mixed race children from their Korean mothers in US-occupied South Korea to adoptive American homes during the 1950s and 1960s. Yuri is also the author of a number of peer-reviewed essays and public-facing works on Korean Americans, transnational and transracial adoption, mixed-race Asians, the so-called comfort women, US military camp towns, and sex work. Grace, Mia, and Yuri, you make a fabulous trio. Thank you so much for being with us today. And now, Professor Grace Cho will start us off.
Thank you so much, Ji-Yeon, for organizing this event, and thank you to Northwestern for hosting it. And I'm really looking forward to hearing from Mia and Yuri when we carry on the conversation later. So I wanted to first start out by just giving a little bit of context for the book, and then do a little bit of reading from it. And since it is a memoir, I like to first contextualize it in a couple of really critical moments in my young life during my coming of age that profoundly shaped my adult life. And, these were these transformative moments that sort of, I think of them as moments that sparked my curiosity, but also my rage. And so the first one was when I was 15, and my mother developed what Western psychiatry calls schizophrenia. And when I tried to seek help for her, I was basically met with denial from my family members. And I was turned away from the community mental health care center because they said there was nothing that they could do for her. And, it was that experience sitting in the office of the counselor that allowed me to see my mother through the lens of disposability. And so I always go back to that moment and describe it as the origin of my han, which is a Korean word that sort of describes this idea of knotted grief and rage over injustice. So going forward, whenever I sought answers to what was happening to my mother, everything I found said that she had a broken brain, because that was the dominant discourse in the 1980s and then into the 90s. But even when I was a child, I knew that there had to be more to it than that. And so it sort of set me on this path of looking for the ingredients of her madness. And then the second moment was on December 30th, 1993. And I remember the date because it was the day before New Year's Eve, and it really impacted the way I then celebrated New Year's Eve that year. It was about a week before my 23rd birthday, when a family member told me that my mother had been a sex worker for the US military in Korea. And, when I look back on my life, I kind of think of that as perhaps the single most traumatic moment of my life, because I then realized that so many of the things that I thought I knew about my family had been a lie. And because I became flooded with all of these feelings of shame. And so over the next months and years, as I processed this information, I started to turn the lens outward toward the systems of oppression that not only created the conditions of my mother's life, but also the deployed shame as a mechanism for keeping us silent about those conditions. I then spent most of my adult life trying to trace my mother's past, to look for answers to the questions that no one in my family would answer for me. And that search led me to graduate school and to the writing of my first book, which involved 10 years of research and writing on the Korean War and US imperialism and the effects of that on the collective psyche of the Korean diaspora. And it just so happened that the 10-year period in which I was researching and writing my dissertation and then later my book coincided exactly with the time period in which I started to cook for my mother. And the trajectory of those 10 years of cooking went from, in the beginning, her refusal to eat what I was cooking, but then by the end, asking me to make Korean foods that she had eaten as a child. And so slowly, over the course of hundreds of meals, she began to talk about the past. And that process was really restorative for me because I finally got to access my family history. I mean, not just through the things that she was saying, but through the foods she was teaching me to cook, and through sharing those meals with her. And so the book is sort of, a chronicle of this decades-long search for the social roots of my mother's schizophrenia, but it's also a commemoration of of our collective survival and resilience and this process of intergenerational healing through the sharing of meals. So I think this would be a good place to read. And I'm going to read from the title chapter, Tastes Like War. When my mother moved into the apartment in December 2001, she'd hardly been eating. Her diminishing appetite had ebbed and flowed for years, hitting a low earlier that fall when she was living with me in Queens. She spent most of her time at my place, sitting on the futon in her room, keeping the TV on for a few hours each morning, sometimes just as background noise. On the morning of September 11th, I popped my head in to say goodbye to her before I left for LaGuardia Community College, where it was my second day working as a writing fellow. She was hanging her head down, staring at the floor as she listened to the local news. The volume was low, and I didn't notice what was flashing across the screen. The first plane had already struck, yet my mother said nothing about it as I walked out the door. Later that day, I would return home in hysterics, having run miles along Roosevelt Avenue after the subways shut down and the phone circuits jammed, demanding to know why she didn't warn me, why she didn't try to call my brother, who worked across the street from the World Trade Center. She said simply that she had failed, that she let me go to work because she thought she could stop it, and not to worry about my brother because she wouldn't allow anything to happen to him. Mom, this has nothing to do with you. This is not in your control. She then put me in my place. Why so much crying? You think you are so special? You are not the only one in the world to go through something like this. Me and my first world privilege, never having known such destruction. I wondered about the family members she had lost in the war and whether she had somehow felt responsible for their demise. I wondered what it was doing to her already traumatized mind to watch the images of New York as a war zone, excuse me, replaying over and over in the aftermath of the event. A few weeks later, she started complaining about her stomach. For 2 days, she vomited bile into a metal bowl, and then I made an executive decision. Mom, we have to get you to the hospital. I am not going anywhere, she said. But you're sick, or you'll get sick if you don't start eating. Look, it might be something simple to treat, like an ulcer. An ulcer? If you are so worried about my getting ulcer, why would you feed me spicy food, huh? She looked me dead in the eye, spitting venom. It was the first time since my teenage years that I felt afraid of her. There was no way to force her to go anywhere if she didn't want to, and the only way I could get her to eat was to tell her I was about to throw something away and then leave it outside her door. It must have appealed to the scavenger in her, the one that emerged during those months she lived with me. At the end of the day, the food would always be gone. My brother and his wife seemed to think that things would improve once my mother had a place of her own. I suppose it was a reasonable assumption. During the first few months, she still didn't want to eat. They tried some of the same tricks I'd resorted to when she was at my place in Queens, like leaving food for her in the hopes she'd eat it, knowing how much she hated for things to go to waste. They also stocked her pint-sized kitchen with large quantities of packaged foods that required no more preparation than adding water or opening a can. According to my sister-in-law, my mother was eating the ramen and fruit cocktail, but had barely touched the powdered milk. Although I felt some relief knowing that she wasn't starving, I also felt ashamed that her diet was so bereft of nutrition. "Mom, are you getting enough to eat?" I asked. She nodded. "What about protein?" She nodded again, then snorted. "They got me powdered milk." "Oh yeah?" I said, feigning surprise. She became quiet as if she had already lost her train of thought and was deep in some hallucinatory reverie. "I can't stand the taste of it," she said. "Tastes like war." It was only the second time she ever brought up the war without my prompting. Her words jolted me into a reverie of my own as fragments of my research tumbled around in my head. Images of babies sitting on dirt roads next to the bodies of their dead mothers and napalmed women bandaged like mummies. The words of a woman who survived the Nogani massacre, who lost her child when American planes dropped bombs from above. That day I saw the two faces of America. The words of a war bride who remembered American food aid. I had heard of the Yankees and how they were here to save us. We were all hoping for rice or barley, and we drooled at the thought of so much food. But it was an endless supply of powdered milk that caused all who drank it to suffer for days with diarrhea. In February 2002, my mother finally went to the hospital after my brother and sister-in-law called an ambulance and had her admitted on the grounds that she was trying to starve herself to death. After the hospitalization, she started meds again, started to eat again, but still not much, not everything. Her resistance still took the form of rejecting food, but the foods she couldn't or wouldn't eat were very specific, like the powdered milk. After Arnold Schwarzenegger was elected as California's governor, she asked me to stop buying her Arnold bread. "Mom, you know it has nothing to do with him, right? The name is just a coincidence." She smiled and let out a little laugh as if she knew how crazy it sounded. She always seemed to put a great deal of thought into her choices to eat or not eat something. In time, I recognized these choices as an expression of agency, tiny acts of rebellion against enormous structures of power. So that's it for my reading. And I think I'll just make one comment about the passage that I read, which is that I want us to think about what the meaning is behind the actions of the voice hearer or the person who has been diagnosed as schizophrenic, right? Because there are times that we just dismiss them because of the label of having schizophrenia, when in fact, there was an incredible amount of meaning to some of these actions. And, I also want people to consider the possibility that hearing voices is not just something always and only pathological, but that those voices might have something important to tell us.
Thank you so much, Professor Cho. Professor Mia Charlene White, the stage is yours.
Thank you to Ji-Yeon, our moderator, whose writing has opened up so many new ways for us to think about Korean diasporic connection across oceans and nations. And you've enabled our coming together tonight. Thank you. My copy of your Beyond the Shadow of Camptown book, like my copy of Grace's book, is dog-eared and marked up with many exclamation points and affirmations. Thank you to Yuri for being a co-panelist whose work and forthcoming book continues in the tradition that Ji-Yeon and others have forged and who I expect to learn quite a lot from tonight and in the future. And thank you to Grace for offering this memoir to the world and for offering it to those who, like her, are mothers navigating intergenerational, familial, and transnational trauma. Sorry, I lost my notes for a second. Here we go. intergenerational, familial, and transnational trauma, white supremacy, and the racial poetics of being seen as a perpetual outsider. In many ways, we are in fact war children because we have inherited war. It's a war that shows up in many ways in our dreams and our bodies and our grief, and it complicates our understanding of what freedom can really mean. I think many mothers know this, and no freedom is impossible without grieving and witness. I felt this reading your memoir. Perhaps it is the conceit of every reader that we readers tend to feel the author has written our hearts and written just for us on our behalf and in our defense. I felt that as I watched you, in your words, unfurl a history and a grief that connects to my own. Because both of our mothers have suffered in ways unrecognized by society as more than simply mysterious or personal burdens, as if any mother's mental and physical health are independent and autonomous from context and culture and environment and war. How could that ever be possible? Frantz Fanon knew it was impossible, and he told everyone so in his writing to decolonize psychiatry, in his linking madness to the contradictions in colonial and post-colonial societies. I like to think, as I was making my notes, that maybe Frantz Fanon and my dad and your mom and so many grandmothers are somewhere having tea or harvesting berries like your mom did, like my own mom once did. Maybe they are somewhere together laughing at peace. The Korean American writer and poet Jung Hae-che has spoken about her childhood memories of cooking and eating with her grandmother in Korea. And after reading your book, Grace, my mind's eye created a room with a stone hearth where you and your mom and Jung and her grandmother and me and my mom and those relatives I've never met. Somehow we were all together and we were eating sundubu. Even though I cannot really communicate this idea to my mother because she is unwell, I have to rely on fantastical imagining because of my mom's life as a shut-in. Her life is, as your mom's was, a fraught testament to the complexity of living with the harm of, as Bell Hooks taught us, may she rest in peace, the imperialist, white supremacist, capitalist patriarchy. It isn't quite freedom to state my mom suffers from spiritual harm, community harm, interpersonal harm, and psychiatric harm, but it is healing to insist she wasn't always this way. Maybe that describes some of the central poetics of your memoir, where you are asking and even demanding that the reader confront the ways in which we have all been conditioned to see psychiatric harm as a purely individual experience or some kind of bad luck, rather than what it is, the socially bitter fruit of biological and psychosocial vulnerability. Unrecognized trauma related to war, occupation, abandonment, exile, displacement, exclusion, estrangement are part of our family war stories. And they matter for how genes express themselves, as you discuss in your book, and for how we're able to navigate in this world. Your book is a call for disalienation on many fronts, and I'm grateful you had the courage to write about it. May your mother rest in peace, and may she rest in the knowledge that she is beloved. My mother is living in Brooklyn, and her living is a testament to her rebellion against a script that rendered her a shameful scourge and a pariah on family and nation for having deviated from the expectation that she would ever have sex outside of marriage, that she would ever defile herself with an American, and certainly not with my beloved dad, a Black American GI, may he rest in peace, and would never create a non-pure or polluted body, mine. I understand even the desire for purity now as a survival instinct, a futile attempt at controlling harm. And I've heard this narrative told to me by many different Koreans in defense of this goal of blood purity. My mom's context was she was born a poor country girl from a family of 9 kids, including an eldest son murdered by the Japanese government, in a family mourning occupation, poverty, loss, and hunger, such as you and Ji-Yeon have written about. At 7.5 months pregnant, alone, sick from unyielding stress and rejection, my young mom fled South Korea to the US in her own heartbreaking and contradictory act of flight. despite the deep aching terror of no longer being considered someone's daughter, and under a wildly misguided fantasy idea about the racial, gendered, and economic utopia America never would be. Mom had very few options for remaining in her country with me, a dusky, brown-kneed, curly-haired child of a Black GI, because the colorism that child might benefit from in the US did not exist in Korea whatsoever. I would not be, and still have never been, recognized by any of my Korean family. And my mom knew I would have no pathway to be recognized by the administrative state of South Korea. And as such, I would have been eligible for public services or an education. She considered dying by suicide, as was suggested to her, as one way to stop the shame on her family. My mother considered the several orphanages populated by thousands of kids who look just like us here on this panel. And I have had the deep, deep honor of knowing many Korean adoptees who are truly some of the most beautiful and the most brilliant and most compassionate people to ever live. And may God bless them in particular in case they're listening. I wanted to say that as I read your book, part of the complexity of being a Black girl of African-American and Korean descent is that I have often found myself on the losing end of racist scripts in the Asian community, where I'm coming from two communities, but only one really allowed me the space to flower and get strong enough to even attempt healing and reconciliation for a whole self. But Grace, I'm grateful that through your words and your labor, you've perhaps unintentionally reminded me that I come from a deeply spiritual set of peoples, all my peoples. I loved it when you talked about Han, and I was so excited to put that in juxtaposition to ideas that I grapple with as an academic, like blues epistemology. I see you like a cousin, and I can see myself in your story and in your excavating all of that strength and resistance. It's incredibly important. I feel like it's the work of decolonizing our ideas about race, about our ways of relating to ourselves, the lands our peoples come from and yearn for. It is a social work, and it is a process. This actually leads me to a challenging topic, a very much third rail conversation I continue to have in the context of anti-Asian violence, the majority of which we know occurs via white assailants. For example, the shootings in Atlanta, which hit me very hard as one of the deceased working class Korean women carries my mother's exact name and had Black grandchildren, but also specifically related to the more recent spate of media attention in New York having to do with Black male assailants suffering from psychiatric harm and social abandonment, who have pursued, killed, and attacked women of Asian descent. The psychiatric harm and social abandonment we might locate in these unspeakable murders connects us in some way, in some painful and difficult way, to the psychiatric harm and abandonment that our mothers have experienced. This isn't or couldn't ever be an equation. It's more an observation that feels urgent to consider. These are historical, state, and institutional alchemies, which require we confront the central fact of psychosocial vulnerability in a capitalist, anti-Black, xenophobic, misogynistic, white supremacist society. Your memoir ended up feeling to me like an invitation to make these kinds of connections because of who I am as your reader, and because the grief work you model in your memoir is critical for any dialectical conversation we might pursue regarding Black Asian solidarities. I mention it here because for me, it is actually a life and death situation. It is grief, it is family, and it is the story of state violence. The weight of divisiveness and possibility within and between communities continues to be a portal through which I learn about history and grief work, much like your memoir. In closing, I want to just reiterate that the United States exists on colonized lands, and through colonization, we are connected to places like South Korea, the Philippines, Vietnam, Okinawa, Puerto Rico, Hawaii, and other places, all marked by the US military-industrial complex. For any students who happen to be watching, please remember that the US military-industrial complex is far and away the world's largest and most prolific environmental polluter, the world's most prolific incarcerator of humans, including through coercion via state-sanctioned sex trade, and the impacts of these intertwined realities disproportionately falls on who? Poor women around the entire world. The US government exports displacement and anti-Blackness and leaves generations grappling with the wreckage. But we have Black feminism and we have transnational emergent frontline feminisms to help us bear witness to what our mothers have carried. Your book recalls this so strongly. It reminded me of Bell Hooks, whose name I say again in gratitude. So when we think of geographies and environmental history, we have to think with and alongside the shared damage that comes from colonization, empire, racial capitalism. We have to pursue justice by centering the body and land as relation, which I felt came up in over and over again in your memoir, envisioning relation as a kind of totem for freedom, itself most felt as a yearning and a longing for diasporic elsewheres that we may long for, even if we have never set foot there in that place, like myself regarding South Korea, or even if that place does not yet exist. The yearning for me is a kind of freedom. And for me, your memoir is the memory of all of these things. Thank you so much for writing it.
Thank you so much. Professor Yuri Doolan, you have the floor.
Thank you to Ji-Yeon and the Asian American Studies program and the Council on Race and Ethnic Studies for putting together and sponsoring this wonderful panel. It's really an honor to be in conversation with you, Ji-Yeon, Mia, and Grace, as well as those of you in the audience here today. I've already learned so much just by listening to my fellow co-panelists. So I wanted to start my time by talking a bit about Grace's first book, Haunting the Korean Diaspora: Shame, Secrecy, and the Forgotten War. Because in reading Grace's work, I think it's the obvious prequel to Tastes Like War, but also on a personal level, I'm not sure a day has gone by since reading Haunting the Korean Diaspora that I haven't thought about it and all that I've learned from it. And what a great opportunity I finally have to share this with Grace and all of you here today. So in Haunting the Korean Diaspora, Grace argues that the Korean War has shaped the psyche of Koreans most everywhere, and even those within the diaspora who didn't experience the war directly. And that is because the war is a forgotten war, which of course is the American moniker used to capture the subordinated position the conflict occupies in the American imagination vis-a-vis World War II and Vietnam, in spite of the death and destruction wrought by the US military on the Korean Peninsula at that time, but also a name that ironically captures this very Korean desire to forget war on an intimate level, a war that was too brutal and too devastating to recall, the Forgotten War. And it's worth reminding that we're talking about a war that claimed the lives of about 1 in every 10 Koreans and separated countless families and left the entire peninsula, in the words of one historian, a smoldering ruin in just 3 short years. The silences around the Korean War, Grace points out, produces a sociological ghost. And that ghost not only haunts the first generation who have suppressed their painful memories of civilian massacres, hunger, disease, lost loved ones, post-war poverty, and desperation, but also the second generation, who are left to wonder about the silences and blank spaces in those narratives, only to be tormented about what it was the first generation actually experienced. This process, Grace points out, produces a sort of transgenerational haunting, hence the title Haunting the Korean Diaspora. There is a figure in particular that embodies this kind of psychic haunting, and it is the figure of the Yanggongju, which is old Korean slang translating literally to Western princess, but really more of a euphemism used to describe the women who fraternize intimately with US soldiers. That woman represents a possibility of marriage to a GI, migration, and the elusive American dream if she is to become a military bride and marry an American soldier. But also she is a symbol of the South Korean state's gendered and sexualized subordination to the US military as a woman sexually serving its personnel and the Camptown Entertainment District surrounding American bases in Korea. So she is both envied and reviled. And most Koreans of a certain generation view these women as shameful family secrets. The lines between GI bride and Camptown prostitute so very blurred. And it is in this uncertainty and unknowing that the young Gongju haunts. I learned so much from Grace's first book, and I remember being so moved by how brave it was to use her own family story so that she could share how histories of violence were shaping our ever-present within the Korean American experience and give people like me a path forward towards understanding and healing. I actually became a historian by following, in some ways, Grace's lead. My parents also met in a South Korean camp town during my father's military tour of South Korea, but later in the 1980s. And shortly after my older brother and me were born, they divorced. The divorce, the shame that it brought, the way that it marked us within our communities and within our families, as well as the hardships of life as a single immigrant mother and whatever it was she had seen and experienced in Korea prior, took a toll on my mother's mental health and survival. And as a child, I remember watching her slowly deteriorate as she lost her ability to regulate her emotions, suffered mood instability, experienced paranoid delusions, and became overburdened by being our caretaker and provider. I remember knowing full well that we were marked in a certain way and internalizing it by thinking maybe that's why our family kept us at arm's length, or why it seemed we were treated differently at Korean church than the other families. And almost as if to explain that to me, I remember being told by my mother as a child that she was not supposed to have married an American soldier, that good Korean women don't marry American men, and so she had made a mistake. And so when I got older and when I wanted to know more about how it was my mother met my father, or better yet, came to be in the company of US soldiers, I used history as a way to fill in the gaps and blank spaces in her narrative that were perhaps too painful for her to recall to me, her youngest son, but also felt really important for me to know so that I could understand her and where she came from, what she had survived, and also what it was I had experienced in my childhood. In other words, I was using history to confront a ghost that had been haunting me. And only in unearthing and bringing that ghost into the light, where it could no longer circumvent my healing or be a wedge dictating my relationship with my mother, was I able to become a good son to her, understand her in her full complexity, forgive her for the mistakes and shortcomings she had made in her unwellness, recognize all she had done and survived, and become her fiercest advocate. I'm so inspired and moved by the ways that Grace is her mother's fiercest advocate and tastes like war, a continuation of that first brave journey to search for and bring her mother, a woman who survived colonialism, war, and displacement, so fiercely out of the shadows and into a place where we can see her in full form and love her. The story of her mother's metamorphosis from the charismatic woman of her childhood to a mother who struggled with her mental health and schizophrenia in middle age, to a mother that when nourished and loved by family found her way home, resonates deeply with my own experiences and memories of my mother. I want to end these initial comments with the following passage from Grace's book, because I think it captures so poignantly the journey I'm on, the path that Grace has trailblazed before me, and for that I feel so grateful and indebted. Quote, "I want to take the fragments of my mother and weave them into a story about her survival. I want to write her back into existence, to let her legacy live on the page, and in doing so, trace my own," end quote. What I've learned from haunting the Korean diaspora and Taste Like War is that only when we have communion with those things that haunt us, that is only when we learn to stop being afraid of the ghosts around us and instead listen intently to what they have to say, only then can something like that be possible. Thank you.
Wow, so much to think about. Your honesty and your love, it's amazing. And it just really shines through. Thank you all for your insights. Now, let's start the conversation with a question for Grace. Now, Grace, we go back a really long time, the early 2000s, when we both worked on Still Present Past, an oral history and arts exhibit interrogating the legacies for Korean Americans of US militarism and the Unended Korean War. After that exhibit debuted in 2005, you published your first book, Haunting the Korean Diaspora, 3 years later. And now, more than a dozen years later, you've gifted us with this incredible memoir, Tastes Like War. So as a historian, and as Asian American Studies scholar, I'm just wondering, what is the evolution of your scholarship over these past 2 decades and in these 3 projects? You know, we can see it in the end products. I'm wondering, what's the backstory, right? What's the through line for you and how has that evolved?
The first thing I want to say, Ji-Yeon, is that you were a huge inspiration to me. So I got your book as soon as I heard about it, like when it was still in hardcover. So I guess it was like 2002 or 2003. So I had read it, before we met for Still Present Pasts. And I draw upon that book heavily in both Haunting the Korean Diaspora and in Tastes Like War. So I just wanted to say thank you for that, because you sort of, I guess, lit this fire for me, of showing me how to, pursue this project of tracing my own family history in a way that was also just so intelligent, right? And so I really felt seen by that work. I was writing my dissertation at the time that I was invited to work on Still Present Past. And I guess for the audience members who are not familiar with what that is, it was a collective art project that was based on the oral histories of Korean War survivors and their children. So I was looking at this from an intergenerational perspective. And Ji-Yeon was the historian for that project, and I was one of the performance artists. So I had been working on my dissertation, which was an earlier version of Haunting the Korean Diaspora. I was looking at the figure of the Korean woman who provides sexual labor for an American. And that sexual labor can either be in the form of marriage or prostitution, or something on that continuum in between, as a ghost that haunts the Korean diaspora. And I use this concept from 2 Hungarian psychoanalysts, Abraham and Turek, who worked with the adult children of Holocaust survivors. So this idea of transgenerational haunting is that the unspeakable secret of one generation turns into a ghost that lives in the unconscious of the next generation. And so I looked at the figure of this woman who was in some contexts hyper visible, but for the most part, she was made to disappear or pushed into the shadows. And not only did the South Korean government do this, she was erased from the discourse of the Korean War, US-Korea relations, from sociological discourses of immigration in Korean America, and also from the family. So that was another thing that Ji-Yeon's work really highlighted, was the way in which these women were so marginalized within their own families. And so as the subject of this kind of serial erasure, she left behind a kind of spectral trace that would animate the next generation. So when you think about this idea of erasure, when you erase something, there's still something left behind. It's not completely gone, right? So while I was working on my dissertation, I had been doing these performance pieces that were based on the idea of the Korean diaspora's collective unconscious. And so I was sort of on the radar of the Still Present Past folks. And so I can't quite remember the timeline, but I know that I was simultaneously working on revising that dissertation into Haunting while I was meeting weekly with Still Present Pasts, the other artists, and developing the project. And so it had a really profound influence on the book ultimately. So, I'm very indebted to Still Present Pasts. So much of it resonated with me, but especially this idea of the absent present that lives among the second generation, the things that our parents don't talk about, but that we sense, right? And so I opened Haunting with a quote from the oral histories that we used in Still Present Past, which I believe also was the opening of the exhibit. It was a quote about how my life felt like, I can't remember exactly what it was, but my life felt like it was normal, except there was this unhappy wind sort of blowing through our house, right? So, that unhappy wind was the idea of the trauma that the parents couldn't talk about. So on one hand, Still Present Past provided me with a lot of data, if you want to think about it from a social scientific point of view, from those oral histories. So I drew upon them a lot in looking at the civilian experiences. But the other thing about Still Present Past that really left an impression on my work was the way in which we did things as a collective. So the way that we created the project together, and it was this interactive exhibit that engaged, not just the artists, but like the participants sort of became part of the art project as well. And it allowed me to theorize kinship in this whole new way. So, I ended Haunting with this idea of the kinship of uncertainty. So it's when you search for family history that has been hidden from you, how do you forge bonds with others? So it's this idea of kinship that's not based on knowing that you're related to somebody, but knowing that the thing that you share in common is the absolute inability to know with certainty what your family history was, right? And so, it's this kinship that's sort of formed around violence, the violence that obscured your history in the first place. So, so that's sort of the trajectory of just, dissertation, Still Present Past, the revision into Haunting, and as Yuri mentioned, Tastes Like War is sort of a sequel. I describe it as an unintended sequel, borrowing Maggie Nelson's words, because when Haunting was in production, my mother suddenly died. And so Tastes Like War was sort of born out of my grief. And all of these memories of her came flooding back to me. So I started to write again. And a lot of the research from my first book made its way into Tastes Like War. But, I think that one development, aside from it being a memoir as opposed to an academic work, is that I really wanted to focus more on the forces that produce schizophrenia, right? And so there's more of an emphasis on xenophobia and racism, and how these things are ingredients to madness. And so if you want to put it in social scientific language, there's social risk factors for schizophrenia, which was little known to us, back when I was, a young person trying to understand everything that was happening with my mother. So that's sort of in a nutshell the intellectual trajectory of these three works, and also my history with Ji-Yeon. And I'm just so happy to be here with you today, having this conversation after all this time that we've shared, all these things we've shared together. So thank you again. So I am going to now ask a question of both Mia and Yuri, and both of you actually addressed it already, but you addressed part of it, but I'm going to ask it anyway. So, prior to ever conceiving of this event, each of you reached out to me on separate occasions to talk to me about Tastes Like War and to talk to me about our family histories and how similar they were. And that was my introduction to Yuri and to Mia, was this sort of like, reaching out saying, I have to tell you that my family history is so similar. So Yuri, you wrote that, quote, "Our experiences with our mothers were strikingly similar. Both of our mothers were women who married US servicemen and immigrated to the US. They were women who experienced gendered and sexualized violence in Korea, only then to experience racism, sexism, misogyny, both overt and covert forms, intense isolation, and social rejection in the United States. They were women who were made to feel shameful and like they had to be secretive about their past in order to protect themselves. And they were both probably suffering from schizophrenia as well as other mental health issues." Mia, you described your mother to me in much the same way and said, quote, I simply cannot believe how much overlap there has been in our very different lives. And you described the similarities as uncanny. And so I want to point out for the audience that our shared experience is in fact not uncommon at all, because we are three of many biracial Americans who were born out of a militarized social arrangement in Korea or in other parts of Asia. And I've had so many people reach out to me to tell me that they too felt like their lives overlapped with mine. And a lot of them were biracial Koreans, some were Korean adoptees, some were biracial people whose mothers were from other parts of Asia. And then I had a couple of men reach out to me to tell me that they had met their wives through the sex industry in Asia and that they were keeping that a secret from their children. And asking me advice about like whether or not they should be keeping these secrets. And I even had a couple of people reach out who said that they lived next door to mixed race families in which there was a Korean woman married to an American, and that as neighbors, they witnessed those women sort of succumb to madness in these very dramatic events. And Ji-Yeon has also written a lot about the psychic pain that Korean military brides have experienced in the US. And so I was wondering if each of you would like to say a bit more about the connections between US militarism and sexual violence in your own lives and family histories, especially as it relates to mental health. And I also have a question for us to think about, which is, can we think of the uncanny not as the similarities in our experiences, but in the ways in which those similarities are obscured, that we thought that this was so unusual, right? When in fact, so many people have had this experience. And so I'm not sure who wants to go next.
Yuri, you want to respond first?
Yeah, certainly. I think to answer this question, it's going to get a little personal. I mean, it's already gotten a little personal, but I really have to go back to the moment where I once and for all diagnosed my mother with full certainty, much like you did, Grace, with schizophrenia. I was quite a bit older than you were at the time. And it was during graduate school, and I was writing my dissertation, and at the time my mom was living with me. And I remember there was this moment where she kept impulsively calling me into her room, interrupting my work, in order to get me to help her to tend to something on the internet. These people she was encountering on social media who were harassing her in her mind. And so I looked, and she was on Facebook, and pulling up the profiles of public officials, government officials, artists, major news outlets in Korea, and suggesting that all of these people had started a huge anti-her movement and that she was in a lot of trouble. And she was basically in tears and shaking in fear as she told me this. And I had a look and I couldn't really understand it. Of course, I had tried to. At that point, I had been treating all of my mom's mental instability and unwellness with a lot of caution, doing a lot of work to not so easily write her off simply as mad or crazy, like me and my brother had maybe done in the past. Because she is an immigrant woman of color who doesn't speak English and us not speaking Korean very well either, there were these cultural and language barriers we were trying to be hyper aware of and careful with. And so for us, the question of our mental state was really confusing. Was she crazy, or was she just kind of, like a Korean ajumma with her own idiosyncratic ways of being? And she was living with me at the time, and she's always been a person with housing precarity and job instability for as long as I can remember. And so the question of whether that was because she was mentally unwell and had these maladaptive behaviors that were keeping her from functioning properly, or if it was because, she's simply an immigrant woman of color with no education in the US, hardly any English, and limited opportunities for social and economic mobility, that was really confusing and very difficult to tease out. Anyway, in this particular incident, it really stuck out more than anything else because she said that people online were calling her a prostitute. And she had always been paranoid. And I remember, as a child, even catching her talking to voices, but nothing like this that was so plain and obviously a delusion. She said that it was all over the internet And Korean politicians were even saying it, that she was a prostitute and that she had shamed her family and embarrassed them because they too had surely seen the headlines. And when I asked, just to make sure for proof of what, it was she was referencing, she showed me these articles about comfort women that of course made no reference to her, but did suggest the issue of sexual violence, but also much less related. She also showed me, just photos of seemingly benign objects posted online that she was trying to convince me of were coded ways of publicly calling her out for being a sex worker. And one of the images I remember was just a photograph of a cute little dog. And she said something to the extent of, this photo is about me because dogs represent dirty women and they're trying to call me a dirty woman. And I was just stunned. And I remember double, triple, quadruple checking with friends whose Korean were way more fluent than mine, trying to see if they could make sense of it. And no one could figure out where she was getting the notion of prostitute from, or even any indication that any of these things were directed towards her. And they just weren't about her at all. I luckily also at the time had some friends who were in medical school or studying medicine. I wasn't in my teens like you were, so I had access to people who were a bit knowledgeable about this, and I was able to talk it out with them. And what I learned was that delusions are often grounded in some sort of reality. And it was really heartbreaking to realize that the reality of the situation was that my mom had, for all of these years, internalized and carried the weight and shame of having married a US soldier, and the ways that that linked her in the minds of so many to military prostitution, that now she was having, full-blown delusions about people calling her a prostitute in her 60s. And I just thought, how much of this has she been holding in this whole time? And, I can't say with entire certainty the full extent of sexual violence she experienced in her past. I have my own theories based on things I can remember hearing throughout my childhood and other things she's paranoid of. So yeah, I can make some of my own educated guesses about that. But really, in addition to the US militarism and sexual violence aspect of it, I think the trauma of migration, or in her case, maybe better to call it displacement in America, followed by intense social isolation from Koreans, both psychically and physically, and also racism and intense poverty. Right, she worked in a factory on minimum wage my entire childhood. I think these things really exacerbated her problems and shaped her trajectory as well. We can't really underestimate the violence of those things on a person's mental health and psyche. These are all very traumatic aspects of her life that she had to endure and survive, and mostly all on her own, with little to no support. So yeah, just wanted to share that. I think that's the first time I've ever actually shared that in a public setting. So thank you for giving me the opportunity.
Thank you, Yuri. That was really intense. My heart is really pounding, and thank you for sharing that. Thank you very much. I think the nature of my mom, her personality, her experience, her trauma, our relationship is such that I'm never going to really know. I think, as you were saying, Grace, there's just a deep inability to really know how actually my parents met. She would tell me things like that they met in an electronics store. That's on the army base in Busan. But she didn't really explain that, and asking her questions, at least back then, was pointless, because she just would choose not to. My mom is a feisty, very intense woman, and a very passionate woman, a very stubborn woman. So she's not going to answer any question that she doesn't feel like answering. In terms of sexual violence, I think that what happened in my childhood with my mom is that she kind of turned her internal shame about the assumptions about the nature of my mother and father's meeting, whether or not there was truth to it, onto me. And I think that has to do with both her trauma as essentially a displaced refugee without community here, but also her picking up racist scripts in the United States about Black women. And so what ended up happening was, in many ways, a very, very traumatic childhood, because, my mother did not see me as Korean. Unlike you, Grace, there was no Korean family or cousins or anybody coming through at all. They fully cut her off and even disallowed her from attending her parents' funeral. So the violence really for my mom is repeating this over and over again. In terms of voices, she hears voices. She and sees things. I'll start with a good one that is not so painful, which is that when she was more well in the 2000s, in the early 2000s, I had a semi-fancy job and I was trying to impress her. And I said, after work, I'll take you to dinner. Let's go. She likes Italian food. To her, this is like fancy food. So we'll go to Italy, then we'll go to Central Park. And as soon as I said Central Park, she said, no, we don't go Central Park. And I said, why, Mom, why? And she said, ghosts there, many ghosts there. And I'm like, Ma, there's no ghosts there. That, can you please try to relax? It's a beautiful park, only to come to realize, of course, there are many ghosts in Central Park. I tried to talk to her about this later. I'd be like, Ma, you were right. There are ghosts in Central Park. There was this village called Seneca Village there. And, there were Black people there and German people and Irish people, and they were living together and doing their thing. And there's even their bones are still, their village was raised, and there's a cemetery, but I can't say all these things to my mom. And the reason is while she is alive, she's unable to communicate with me. She does not answer the door, she does not answer the phone, I pay all the bills, but she's not able to be with me. And so when you wrote this thing early in the book, where you wrote, paradoxically, it was my mother's very absence that gave her a new presence in my life. And then you go on to talk about your grief. That was one of the things that really resonated so strongly with me. Even though I use the word uncanny, it's not that I don't understand that similarities are obscured, but because you are mixed with white, my racial experience is just so profoundly, different. And yet I'm reading your book, and I've marked up so many places in your book where our experience is the same. Now, it definitely also deviates quite a lot. Yuri brought up an example of the Korean church, and I have a more challenging vignette, which is, my mother was fully ostracized, not only from her family, but also from Korean people in Queens. And we were in Elmhurst, Queens at the time. Nobody would ever look at her or make eye contact with her. It was a very painful experience. So she decided one day that she was going to be a good Korean mom, and she was going to take me to Korean church. So we go to this church. I don't know the name of it. It just had white pillars on the outside. It's on Queens Boulevard. And we walk in, and immediately everything changed. People were staring at us and pointing at us, just outright. We sat down, and everybody got up from the pew. And so it was just me and my mom in the pew, and it's a packed church, and everybody is staring. And I'm looking at her, and I'm saying, Ma, in English, Ma, we have to go. They don't want us here. And she said, we're not going. And she just stared straight ahead. And it was really hard. It was a feeling of pride in my mom, but also like, I think something really dangerous could happen here. And I'm not sure if my mother has the capacity to understand that. The whole time people were talking about us, a couple of times children threw things at us. I felt the sweat going down my back. It was really like, got to be, almost one of the worst hours and a half of my life. And later she told me is, Mia, they think you are a prostitute. They think you are a hooker. That's what they said to me. And for me to experience that from my mom was just so shocking. I mean, I was like reading Sweet Valley High, and I was nothing, nowhere even near, approaching sex work. But what she was saying to me is that that's what she felt. She felt the shame, and she wanted to sit there and bear it. And one of the gifts that I think that she's given me is, and we talked a little bit about this in our prep, is that she's a very stubborn woman. And she refuses to be fully killed, fully marginalized, fully silenced. So even though we sat there in that very miserable church, the priest was looking directly at us and saying things that I did not understand. I knew that we were not going to leave until this thing was done. We were going to sit there the whole time. Yeah, so I'll just end this little bit by saying that, my mom is troubled, and it is from the social context that her vulnerability has been. All of these very deeply stressful events, yes, may have some biological basis in terms of vulnerability, et cetera, and so forth. But like you wrote about, Grace, it is a social context in which schizophrenia and other mental health diseases are expressed. And yeah, so for me, this is really about broadening where we see from and how we understand problems and how we see each other. And I think that your book really helped me do that. I said uncanny because though it makes maybe not so much sense right now, at the time, I wasn't really sure what we would have in common. And I see we have quite a lot in common.
Thank you both so much for answering that question. It was so much more than I expected to hear. I'm really moved. Thank you.
Bia, do I go ahead and ask your question?
Thank you.
You're muted.
Sorry. Okay. Grace, a theme in your beautiful writing has to do with the pain and agony of estrangement, like what we've been discussing, of state-sanctioned, enabled exile, and the damage this does in your life, in our lives. Do you think grief work, as in this memoir, as in food, as memory and visitation, do you think grief work can help us decenter the state as we look for ways back to ourselves and each other? Because we're talking about structural histories and various state powers in this narrative around what's happened to our families. Do you think we can decenter the state? Have you found students in particular, I'm curious about, connecting with you on the power of grief work?
Yeah, I'm really glad that you framed it in terms of decentering the state to make that really explicit, because the psychic conditions that we've been talking about are manifestations of oppression and state violence. And so I think we absolutely have to think of it in those terms, because if you think about what the state's dominant response is to people who are in severe psychic distress, it's either to incarcerate them or murder them. So if you have an untreated mental illness, you're 16 times more likely to be killed by the police. And then, we have to ask this question, what treatment is? And so, in the US, the 3 largest quote unquote mental health care providers, Cook County Jail, LA County Jail, Rikers Island, right? And so, this responding to mental illness with policing just perpetuates this illusion that the root of the problem lies in the individual rather than in the state itself. And so, I'm glad you asked the question about students, because I don't think I had actually given it that much thought before, but I in fact do bring in a lot of conversation about grief and grief work without even having realized it, because I teach a class on policing and mass incarceration, in which so many of the students are grieving loved ones who have been incarcerated, and then I teach another class on the sociology of mental illness, where that conversation figures very heavily, and the students are really responsive to it because they're all sort of silently grieving, so in the sociology of mental illness class, we talk about the way in which grief is pathologized, because in the US, we live in a very grief averse society. And so if you look at the DSM, for example, grief is sometimes interpreted as major depressive disorder, or as pathological grief, right? There's another designation, a new disorder. When the person doesn't get over their grief fast enough, they can be diagnosed with pathological grief. And so this, like if that's a dominant response, incarceration, policing, or medication, then we have to start to ask these questions about what grief can do for us. So I think for the students, it's a really powerful idea that not only is grief normal, but it's necessary. And I don't mean necessary from a psychological point of view, but politically it's necessary, right? Because we have to remember those historical traumas. And we have to remember the lives of all the people who have either been killed or left to die because of state violence. And so, no wonder it's treated as a pathology, because there's this tremendous political power in grief work. And so, yeah, thank you. I think that's an excellent question.
Grace, my question for you is, I've struggled personally with this balance between my right to know the story of my origins, my right to own it for myself, my right to fully explore it and embrace it for what it is, who it has made me into, with, of course, respecting the privacy of my own mother, who is less keen to share these details from her past, at least to me, her youngest son. And in fact, as I mentioned earlier, her silence around our family history is precisely what made me want to become a historian in the first place, to fill in the gaps and blank spaces in that narrative that were maybe too painful for her to revisit or recall, but really seemed important for me to know so I could understand her and where she came from. I wonder, since, as we've been talking about, so many of our experiences seem to be parallel, if you also struggled with something similar and how it was you came to resolve that tension within yourself.
Yeah. I mean, that tension is real, and you're not alone, because I've had this conversation with other writers and academics who are exploring their family histories, just out of this need or deep desire to understand it. But then if the history contains something that the family considers stigmatizing, then it can be a really difficult path. And I don't really think there's any easy way to navigate it, especially if you have family members who want to keep the silence. And that has been the case for me, So I have a long history of a couple of family members who have actually tried to stop me from writing or discredit my publications. And it goes back to when I was working on my first book. But that the experience that I had with my mother was really the most important. I mean, she was the only person in my family whose opinion mattered to me. And she eventually came out in support of my first book, but it took many years to even get to that conversation, because my thinking was, when I was in graduate school, that I would tell her what I was working on as soon as she asked, but then she never asked, and so years went by, and the tension just grew, because, even if I brought my computer and all my books to her house and worked from her apartment, and she could obviously see that I was writing something, she never asked me what I was writing about. I talk about my dissertation. She never asked me what it was about. But then about 8 years in, she actually found out about my dissertation and my book project from another family member. So not from me. So she heard about it and she asked me about it. And it was actually this amazing moment for me, because I had the the opportunity to tell her what my intention was, and that my hope was that I could write about the things that were considered shameful in such a way that their meaning would be transformed, and then they would no longer be so shameful. And I had the opportunity to say to her, I know what you did for a living in Korea, and you don't have to be ashamed of it. Because, growing up, whenever I asked her what she did in Korea, it was always, this moment of complete dissociation where it was like, I don't, she just would stare at the wall and not answer me. And, I think that the message that I tried to send her in that conversation really got through to her, because she did come out in support of my work from the very beginning, but over time, she actually became excited about it and would ask me every time I saw her if I had the book yet, because she wanted to see the book. And so I think that there was a certain kind of delight too of being featured in it, so it was very surprising, and it did, in that sense, had a really happy ending. But I don't know if it's so easy for everyone.
What an amazing story, Grace, right? That moment of communion between mother and daughter. I just feel like that is so precious. So it moves me to ask, what are the gifts from our mothers that they've given us? And how do we access those gifts? Sometimes it's hard. Sometimes we don't recognize that they've given us a gift,
Mhm.
So how do we recognize the gifts when they're given to us, and how do we access them?
Mhm. I don't know. I've always had sort of a hard time disentangling myself from her, because whenever I write anything about myself, it's always related to her story as well. But I think it's just this desire to sort of, want social justice, to sort of examine things from a broader perspective. I think that's definitely a gift that I got from my mother, so in the way that she's framed my thinking and my worldview. And even even the fact that I went and got a PhD, so like that education is something that was a gift from her, because, both that she really wanted me to be educated, but because I used the doctoral program as the structure through which I could explore these questions, right? And so, whenever I do this work, like whether it's writing or speaking or teaching, I always feel like that is a gift from my mom. I don't know, Mia and Yuri, if either of you want to say anything.
Yeah, I'll just say that I think, I've watched my mom go through so much. And so one of the gifts sort of watching her struggle is to pay a lot of attention to how experiencing her struggle and her trauma shows up for me in my body and also in my mothering. And so I have had to do a lot of work to not reproduce some of the habits that I may have witnessed in our very complicated family dynamic. But another gift, I think, is, humility. My mother did not have an education. She is not a Seoul city girl. She's from the country with very little education. After my parents divorced, my mom got me from my Black grandmother who was raising me, and we cleaned by her side. We cleaned, rich people, Manhattan people's apartments. We cleaned people's homes, and the process of taking the train and carrying these materials, the process of doing the work, watching my mother do it, her not letting me do some things because she didn't want me to, and she wanted, like cleaning toilets, she kind of, she wanted to preserve me from some things. Watching her figure out a way in very challenging circumstances to preserve dignity. Even her sense of humor, where we would make fun of some of the white people did not take off their shoes in their homes. And so we would have kind of an inside banter about anyway, et cetera, and so forth. And then in addition to that, we became street vendors. We sold socks and underwear and leotards sometimes, pantyhose on plastic tables in Lower Manhattan. And then at the Aqueduct and Belmont racetrack, they have an outdoor flea market. And then we graduated to an Afro-Caribbean indoor flea market mall called the Coliseum on Jamaica Avenue. Some people listening may know it. And I watched her navigate some incredibly challenging racial dynamics as a Korean immigrant woman in essentially a Black space, while all kinds of things were happening in LA, the Korean grocery issue, boycott, and I mean, we lived through that, literally lived through that. And I saw her never back down. Sometimes it came across to other people like she was nuts, but other times it came across to people as she's somebody to reckon with. And so I take that from her. I've told students, sometimes you have to be okay with the fact that people will actually laugh at you sometimes. People will laugh at you sometimes. This is a conversation that I often have with students who are grappling with internalized shame. For me, it's sort of like, so what if people laugh at you sometimes? It is what it is. People are going to think that you're ridiculous sometimes, because sometimes you are ridiculous, but we're also amazing and hardworking and very special. And I think I get that perspective from my mom.
It's been so nice to hear both of your thoughts on this question. It's such a difficult, I think, thing to sum up, because my relationship with my mother is so formative. It's so, it's been the most important and the most difficult relationship of my life. And Grace, like something you said, it's hard to disentangle, disentangle the parts of me that aren't gifts from my mother, because in many ways, my life trajectory has been shaped by her and kind of all that she inspired. I think, though, similarly to Mia, it's this grit and this survivor's instinct that I witnessed. It was the way that I saw her every day wake up and go to her job on the assembly line at a factory for years and years and years, just to provide, and coming home exhausted, coming home, in pain, but still coming home and being our mother in ways that she knew how, and making our very small 1-bedroom apartment in Cleveland, Ohio, a little haven of her Korea that she could give to us. So I think witnessing that really instilled in me, the ideas of perseverance and hard work. And she always, told us to aspire and reach for more, to be more than what she could be, because this was all she could do right now. But we could be more, and we could have more if we, studied hard and worked hard like her. So I think those are the gifts, that come to mind. But it's just such an impossible question, because the gifts, I think, are just so endless. And as I said, it's just such a difficult and important relationship for me. And I'm still, I think, working through that as, a young person as well. So.
Thank you for that. That's just all so moving. I can really feel the thoughtfulness and the relationship that you have with your mothers. We are running toward the end of the program, and so I'd like to ask each of you to think about just one word or one phrase that you would like to leave us with. Should we go in backwards order? I'll put my former student on the spot. We'll go Yuri, Grace. I'm Yuri, Mia, and then Grace.
Um, I don't know if I have one word or one phrase, but I do have kind of a scene from Grace's book that I keep coming back to. And it's the scene where her mother prepares for the recently adopted Kay and Jason, who were adopted into a Chehalis family from South Korea, kimchi. She labors with her bare hands, and she makes it so that these children have kimchi as sort of a way for them to endure all that they had lost in that moment. And maybe the word is endure, survival, or maybe the word is Han or Jung, because I think that moment in the book, it really stuck with me because it was such a poignant and beautiful tribute to the beautiful person Grace's mother was. And it just represents that intense collective sorrow of the Korean diaspora, and also that intense feeling of love for one another. So maybe the word is survival, endurance, Jung, Han, I'm not sure, but that scene has been on my mind. So thank you, Grace, for allowing us to bear witness to your mom through your stories. And it's really been an honor to be in conversation with you all today.
Yeah.
I would say relation. I think relation is the word that I'm thinking about. My life story in relation to yours, Grace, and yours, Yuri, and yours, Ji-Yeon. And maybe those listening are thinking the same thing. What is the relationship between my story and the stories that we've talked about here? And then I also say relation because I think that really is the way through. It kind of through a lot of the pain. When we think of ourselves as relations, maybe it's a little easier to activate a tenderness principle where we can say, we have suffered and we have experienced distinct harms that overlap with the other harms that we hear about, but the ritual and resistance of insisting that we're relations seems to be, I think, for me, like an indispensable way to live some of the questions that you posed in your book to persist and to not just see the stories of our mothers as only trauma and grief. They've left us with that, and they also have left us with so much more than that, because in many ways they've survived the end of the world, right? At least for my mother, I'm not sure what else could be worse for your family to fully reject you and to never see them again. I'm not sure what could be worse. And so her survival is very fraught and complicated, but her survival is in relation to mine, and her trauma is in relation to what's been going on in the world with regard to war. And so I'd like to offer that word as a word that I'm thinking about.
And I'll offer the word restorative, because I think I started off talking about how the process of sharing these meals was restorative to me. But I think also in hearing Mia and Yuri speak, I also heard that in, you're speaking about these moments or words or acts that were restorative in your own relationships with your mothers. And, my other word, of course, is gratitude. So I'm tremendously grateful for this conversation, but also just, to be engaged in conversation with others as well.
Thank you. So, we have not questions in the Q&A, but comments in the Q&A saying things like, I've seen my own story reflected in the story shared today, or as a mixed race Korean adoptee, thank you for sharing your stories. I feel so connected to some of this, although I did not grow up with my Korean mother. One question, do you have any plans or recommendations for moving these stories forward, either personally or into the broader community? I feel like that is such a huge and amazing kind of question. I want to say that education is really important, that having more people write their stories the way that Grace has done, and the way that in many ways Yuri is doing is so incredibly important. But also for every one of you who's here tonight, talk about what you heard today, right? Discuss this with your friends. And the more we talk about this, the more open Korean American society and Korean society and American society can be about these issues. We also have a kind of administrative question, which is there going to be a replay? And yes, there is. All of you will receive in a day or two an email with a link to a recording of this webinar. So that's another thing you can do too, is share the recording widely with all your friends and family members who could not be here today. This has been such an amazing conversation, and I'm so sorry that we are running out of time and that we are actually 3 minutes over time. Thank you so much to our speakers, Grace and Mia and Yuri. And thank you also to you, our wonderful audience, and for the supportive comments that you have given to us. Korean American experiences with war and its legacies are not unique. Rather, they're frighteningly common, right? So each American war, whether in Asia, or the Middle East, or elsewhere, each instance of wartime and military violence spawns its own painful legacies. Last night's invasion of Ukraine by Russia also demonstrates that military violence and war making are not unique to the United States. What consequences are we going to see from this new war? My own family has fled from war, refugees in their own country. We became penniless in war, and we have been divided by war, family members separated by seemingly impenetrable DMZ and all that it signifies. We have married American soldiers, and we have migrated under the shadow of war. So as a Korean American, my heart goes out to all the peoples of Vietnam, Afghanistan, Ukraine, to all those whose lives have been irrevocably altered by war. And I strongly feel that we must muster up the courage to tell our truths about war and its consequences, and the compassion to really listen to each other's truths. And we have to continue to explore and analyze and reveal the many different intersecting histories that we have touched on today. And as we do so, our paths will surely cross again. Perhaps we may also be able to journey together toward a sustainable, equitable peace. Until then, may you all be healthy and may you be joyful and loving. Until next time, thank you and farewell.